Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Profit Minds podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch, creator of the Profit Minds Growth System, a unique blend of profit growth, productivity acceleration, and building robust business process for scale. In every episode, I interview entrepreneurs and small business owners from around the world with a unique story to tell. You can find the show on YouTube, LinkedIn, Apple and Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, and more. Well, hi, everyone. Today, my guest is Chloé Nwangwu, the brand scientist and director of NobiWorks. And today, we're going to talk about how to evade the invisibility tax. Welcome, Chloé.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the first question I always ask, tell me your story. How did you get to be, I love this, the brand scientist?
A great question. Thank you for asking. So my story is actually pretty non-traditional, actually. I did not go to school for any of this. I did not get an MBA. I didn't do any of those things. I was trained to facilitate peace negotiations in the context of civil war and in international or interstate conflict. So what that means is anytime you see a conflict within a country or between countries, I was one of the people that folks would call in to facilitate those conversations. That was what I was trained to do.
Wow.
And my speciality was leveraging what we know about the human brain and about the dynamics of human social relationships to make those settlements more likely to happen and more effective, more likely to last. And so I was doing my thing.
That's a long way from branding.
I know.
Put it out there.
Yeah, but honestly, it's not as long as one might think, and this is why, right? I think the thing that I learned from this work is that every actor that I had ever worked with, whether they were a nation state or like a democratic separatist move, like whatever it happened to be, right? They all had brands. All of them had brands.
Interesting.
And you can see that in the ways in which these actors choose to interact with each other, right? There's a reason that you don't make certain moves with Germany or France, right? And that's because their brands have taught others how they would respond to those things, right? So what I learned in my work is that brands teach others how to treat you. And this is something that came to a head for me when I was, to be clear, a very junior member of a team working on the civil war in Yemen. And we'd actually been brought on to support an ethnic minority in the region who, as far as the UN peace process was concerned, was not a part of the negotiations, right? And this ethnic minority, who, despite being an ethnic minority, were still a pretty sizable chunk of the population, they wanted to have a hand in what their country was going to look like for the next, presumably, 50 years or so, right? And so they brought us on to help get them into those peace talks. And so much of my training as an international mediator, as a conflict resolution specialist, prepares me to navigate and influence the dynamics within rooms like these, right? But here I was presented with an issue where folks who really should have been in this room, if the peace settlement was going to last beyond 5 or 10 years, right? Folks who really should have been in this room in order for this thing to be sustainable weren't even getting in the door. And that was not something that was handled in my toolkit as a mediator. And so I had to sit down and frankly think about what it would take to make sure that folks like this group could get into these rooms. And my research led me to brands. I realized that when folks who should be in rooms like this don't get into rooms like this, it's often because the folks who are at the door can afford to ignore them. And so if we...
There's no brand recognition.
Precisely. That's exactly right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And so if you can develop the brand in such a way as to invite that recognition, that opens access to many, many spaces. And by the time I was done with my work on that file, and again, I was a very junior member of this team. I was not the only person working on this team. I was not the only person using these strategies and who had this mindset, right? However, with all those caveats, I want to say that by the time I was done working on this file, they were in the peace talks. So when that happened, I knew that I was onto something. And I began to look more deeply into this phenomenon of, folks not getting access into these rooms, what could be causing that, and then what my background in behavioral science, network science, social psychology, and all of those other things can tell us about how to deal with that. And that's what led me to what I do now.
That's fascinating. So a couple of things tweaked my interest there in your story. And it's really clear that some of the people, negotiators are trained to deal with the people that are at the table.
Precisely.
And they're not trained probably to look for people who should be at the table who are not.
That's right.
Because that complicates their job.
Exactly.
There's a disincentive for them to invite additional people to the table.
Yeah, that's right.
And so that must have made that job that you had doubly hard.
Yes.
Because you had to convince, not only did you have to convince all of the parties at the negotiation table,
correct,
but also the negotiators.
That's exactly right.
This was enough of an important piece to the settlement or to the agreement.
Yeah, that's right. No, that's exactly right. And that actually is one of the things that features in the methodology that I eventually developed, right, over time and have developed since that experience. And it is namely this, that whenever access is an issue, right, as is often the case with those that I call underrecognized, and we'll get to this in a moment,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Whenever access is an issue, there are always multiple stakeholders that you need to be aware of, that you need to understand the motivations of, and that you need to frame that intel helpfully about. And I say that because this may be an assumption, but I imagine a lot of the people who are listening to this podcast are business owners or are folks who are sort of in that realm of experience. And I'm sure that they have been told, hey, just focus on your ideal client avatar and you're good. So
of course, that's mantra from day one.
Precisely.
The riches are in the niches, and you figure out who that ideal avatar is. And
right? That's right. I am known in these internet streets. If, aside from all the other stuff, I'm known in these internet streets for kind of saying, nope, that's a really bad idea. And here's why. Ideal client avatars are not great and bad. Niching is not great and bad. And this is one of the reasons why, that when it comes to visibility and attention and all of the things that those elements are supposed to help garner for you in your business, when it comes to those things, having an ideal client avatar or having a niche assumes that visibility and attention are neutral. They assume that, okay, cool. If you get in front of your ideal client avatar, they will notice. And once they notice, they will act. And that's not what research is showing. And that's not what the anecdotal experience of millions is showing.
So what is it that you're supposed to do then?
Yeah. So I'm sure there are a number of different thinkers and scholars and the like who have different answers to this question. For
But what does
me,
the brand science tell?
yes. So my response to this is that, for example, rather than doing an ideal client avatar, right, you do something that I call a stakeholder spectrum. Right. And so a stakeholder spectrum is something that is effective across a few different vertices, right? On the one hand, it allows you to pinpoint and pick up stakeholders that will be required for your success that you may not even be aware of, right? And let me tell you a story about why this is important. Let me give you an example about why
Yeah,
this is
that'd be
important.
great.
So a friend of mine told me a tale of a business that was opening up essentially in a Brooklyn analog, right? And they had their ideal client avatar down to a T, right? And so they made sure that everything, and this was a brick and mortar business, right? They made sure that everything was tailored to that ideal client avatar, right? Right
Sure,
down.
that's what you're told to do.
That's what you're told to do, right? Right down to how they accepted payments, right?
Okay.
And for their ideal client avatar, accepting payments looked like having one of the cell phone readers, right? Like no cards, no cash, just like tap your phone and go, right? Like that was
Yeah.
the thing, right? Brilliant work from the perspective of an ideal client avatar, right? Not so brilliant when you took into consideration the folks who actually lived around this business locally. These folks at the time didn't have cell phones with technology that allowed them to engage with that, cell phone reader.
Yep.
Yeah. And so what that meant is that they couldn't engage with this store. They couldn't come here. And the reason that's important is because, or what that demonstrates or what that illustrates, is that you may have an ideal client avatar, right? Which is just a composite of things that we're hoping to be true or have observed to be true about a possible prospect.
That
right?
we imagine to be true.
That we imagine to be true, right? And it's increasingly ridiculous amounts of detail into, said avatar composite person's life, right? But that doesn't allow you to notice or capture the folks like what happened in this scenario, right? The folks who actually lived in the community.
That are perhaps geographically close.
Precisely, right? And this business had, like, they could only profile who they were aware of, right? Like that's one of the limitations of being of an ideal client avatar. You can only profile who you're aware of. And the ways in which ideal client avatars ask you to profile folks is, again, by imagining things and putting together
it's pick your 3 favorite clients, for example, and what do they have in common? And right? That's
that's exactly right. And so what this story sort of demonstrates is that there are opportunities or mistakes that could easily be avoided if we were just aware of the stakeholders that our businesses need. Right?
So how do you imagine that stakeholder universe, which is so different from your own experience?
Yeah, and that's where the stakeholder spectrums come in. So here's how a stakeholder spectrum works. I know not everybody is going to be able to like see what I'm doing, but maybe we can, and this is a note to self, include a graphic in a resource page so you can kind of see what this would look
That'd be
like.
great. We can include that in the show notes.
Yeah, yeah. And so for those who are watching, I'm going to be using my hands to illustrate what I'm talking about here. So when I'm doing a stakeholder spectrum with clients, right? First things first is I will do at least 3 of these, right? And the stakeholder spectrums are along vertices that are important. So the first one that I always do is receptivity, right? How receptive is the stakeholder to what you're doing and how you're doing it, right? Here is how a receptivity spectrum works, right? We have a spectrum, a line, right, with 2 points. On one side, we have the most receptive, right? What stakeholder is the most receptive to how you're doing things, why you're doing things, et cetera, et cetera, right? On the other side, we have the least receptive. Which stakeholder is the least receptive to how you're doing things, right?
Can you say most resistant? Is that different?
So I might say that's different, and that might be a different spectrum,
Okay.
right? And the reason for that is this, right? That someone who is a couple of things. One, the person who is, or the stakeholder who is the least resistant. Sorry, let me think that through again. The stakeholder who is the least receptive, right? One, that doesn't mean that they're not receptive at all, right?
Okay.
So that's one thing. And the second thing is that does not also then translate to mean that they are resistant. All it means is that they are the least receptive. That's all that means.
Okay. All right. I see. I get the distinction.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
and that's why we need a scientist to help us understand.
That's my job. And so we have the 2 points of the spectrum,
Okay.
right? And then in the middle, we have mid-level receptivity, right? So like who's
Yeah.
someone who's like somewhere in between these 2 poles, right?
Okay.
And depending on the business or organization that I'm working with, we'll do 2 other spectrums at least along different spectrums, right? So we do
Different
receptivity,
vertices. Yeah.
different vertices, right? What's another good example? Some might be one that's always interesting is proximity, right?
Okay.
So like geographic proximity, right? Another one that is always interesting is power, right? And there is someone who has the most power, the least power, mid-level power, right? But then there's also empowered by, which is a completely different spectrum, right? A
Sure.
completely
Sure.
different vertice, right? So it just sort of depends. The business that I'm working with, the goals that they have, which spectrums we bring to bear, right? But the one that I always start with is receptivity. Now, when you do a stakeholder spectrum, right, that allows you to say, okay, cool. Like, let's take this example of the business in the Brooklyn analog, right? They look at the way in which they are setting up their store, for example, right? And the ethos and everything that's behind that, right? Who's the most receptive to the way that we are doing things in our brick and mortar business right now? Cool. It might be the person that they had sort of begun to imagine with their ideal client avatar, right? Who's the least receptive? Oh, well, now there's an interesting question. Who would be the least receptive to this? Why would they be the least receptive to this? Right. And so that invites investigation. Right. And then we have mid level receptivity. Right. And so, yeah, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I'm going to jump in and ask.
Please.
So do you simply say, well, the people who are least receptive, we're not going to try to reach out to them, or are we going to,
Oh,
we're going to go after them, but we're going to go after them in a different way because
yes.
their antennae are
Yes.
not tuned to this frequency, and therefore they're receptive to a different message than the people who are most receptive. Is that
You are in fact picking up what I'm putting down. And this is where we get to the idea of someone having a palette of stakeholders, right? You have more than one stakeholder. And I've identified a minimum of 5 stakeholders that are required for the success of pretty much any venture, right?
Okay.
But that number can expand depending on the kind of business you're running, right? Or the kind of organization that you're running. So the 5 general kinds are these. There is your protagonist, right? And this is basically the ideal client, right? But think about this as the person who's making the decision as far as your business is concerned, right? This is the person who's making the call. So protagonist. Then we have champion, right? This is a former protagonist, right? Someone who has worked with you before, is ready to sing your praises, right? Now, these two, I'm sure, are things that folks are pretty familiar with.
Right.
Then we get to the third stakeholder type here. This has often been a key unlock for a lot of clients that I work with, and that's the gatekeeper. Gatekeepers are folks who are standing between you and greater opportunities. They're not necessarily your adversaries, but they are standing between you and an opportunity on the other side, right? Who are these gatekeepers? The next type, mediators. I might have been a little biased when I chose that name. Yeah, mediators. Mediators are directly connecting you to opportunities. Now, a mediator can be a gatekeeper, and a gatekeeper could be a mediator, but they're not always one and the same, and that's why I like to keep them separate. Final stakeholder type, advocate. Folks who are speaking about you in rooms that you don't happen to be in yet. These are the 5 most basic kinds. And
so I'm sorry, I want to do this again. So you had the protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
What was the second one?
Champion.
The champion. And how are they different from an advocate?
Yeah, that's the last thing that I was going to say.
Okay.
Champion and advocates. And a champion is a kind of advocate, right?
Okay.
But not all advocates are champions. Champions are always folks who have worked with you in the past. They've always folks who were a protagonist and now have moved past that status.
Okay.
An advocate, yeah, if they were a protagonist at some point, then they're also a champion, right? But not all of the folks who are speaking about you in these rooms are folks who have worked with you directly before.
Okay. And how does an advocate different from was it negotiator or
Mediator?
A mediator? How is it?
Yeah.
So
the difference I would say is this, right? That a mediator is actually doing like direct connecting, right? So a great example of this might be that collaborator of yours who introduces you to someone who hosts a podcast and says, hey, this person would be a great guest on your podcast, right? That's a mediator, right? And they're putting you directly in touch with that person. That person's a mediator. Okay. An advocate, they would be operating a little differently in that scenario, right? They probably aren't putting you in direct contact with that person, but they might have, while you were at dinner or at something, have said, oh, you know who might be a great person for you to consider? Or you know what? No, not even that. They might just be talking about you, right? They might be saying, I met this really interesting person who does X, Y, and Z, and this is their business model, and like they're very, very interesting, right? They may not even be thinking about it in terms of like you and your work, right?
Got it. Okay. Yeah. So we have 3 that are, I'll say, somewhat related in at least in my brain. And that's the champion, who, as you said, is former protagonist.
Correct.
Right? And the advocate, who is out there singing your praises, may or may not have been a client or a protagonist.
Yeah.
Right. And then the mediator, who is the connector.
Yeah.
Right. They're directly connecting you. So the advocate will go out there and say, wow, this was great. I loved working with this person.
Yeah. Or even I loved, like, I went to, and like, I was at a conference where this person spoke and like, they said this really interesting thing, and gee willikers, isn't that amazing? Right.
Got it.
Like, they don't even have to, so yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
And
so
sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. So those are the 5
most basic stakeholder types, right, that pretty much any endeavor is going to need in order to succeed, right? And the thing that you want to do, and the thing that the sort of stakeholder spectrum exercise is leading you to, is actually discovering your own particular palette of stakeholders, right? It's one thing for me to tell you, like, yeah, there are 5 kinds of stakeholders, and like try to figure out like who your protagonists are, who your champions are, who your gatekeepers are, et cetera, right? It's another thing entirely for us to sit down and do a stakeholder spectrum and find out that, like, yes, you have protagonists, you have gatekeepers, but you also have like this other weird kind of stakeholder that like isn't part of this group of 5, right? That is something that we need to pay attention to, right? And so that's why I do the stakeholder spectrums. But they can, and often do, lead to your own tailored palette of stakeholders. That's how that works.
Interesting.
And so that's what I do instead of ideal client avatars.
Yeah, and obviously the message that you give to those different people
Yes.
depends dramatically on which part of the spectrum they fall in. Are they
Precisely.
receptive or not?
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right.
Yeah,
Are they proximate or not?
that's
Are they,
right.
right? And so and so that it's not that you're not looking for that ideal client, because you still do, but that's not the only person you have to market to.
Yeah, one, that's not the only person that you have to market to, and 2, and this is maybe like the second or third step that one would take with this particular process, right? Rather than looking at what ideal client avatars do, which is saying, hey, demographics, right? And if we're like really on the edge, we're doing psychographics, right? Like habits and preferences and things, right? Like instead of that, right? What this methodology focuses on is motivations and motivational drivers, right? And that's the final key difference. That when we're looking at protagonists, for example, right, versus an ideal client avatar. An ideal client avatar says, okay, this is a middle-aged woman, white, college educated, blah, 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 prefers Netflix over Hulu, et cetera, right?
Yep.
A stakeholder profile, I call them relationship portfolios, right? But like looking at a protagonist, right? We're saying, okay, what would motivate this protagonist to change their behavior? And what are the motivational drivers in their environment that are contributing or generating those motivations? And the thing that's key here is this: lots of different kinds of people can have the same motivations and the same motivational drivers to generate them. And so that that is one of the huge differences, right? That folks are like, what do you mean you don't do demographics? What do you mean? What do you mean psychographics are like less important? What do you mean by that? And what I mean is that the key piece of information or data that's actually going to get someone to change their behavior, which ultimately is the thing that we are trying to get them to do, is motivational. It's not demographic. Sometimes it can be psychographic, but not always, right? And it's environmental. It's motivational and it's environmental. And weirdly, that's the kind of information that ideal client avatars tend to leave out.
Fascinating. So we have a couple minutes left. I would love to understand what you mean by the invisibility tax.
Great question. So remember when I said we'd get to the idea of under-recognition that I brought up way at the beginning? So under-recognition is something we have to understand before we can understand the invisibility tax. This is under-recognition. It is merely the phenomenon wherein your ideas and breakthrough contributions are overlooked or underappreciated as the status quo. That's what it means to be underrecognized. And underrecognition, this phenomenon, has sort of two sides if you're going to think about it as a coin, right? One side is the source or the cause of underrecognition. And I call those visibility biases. And then the other side is the invisibility tax. Now, visibility biases, they're just cognitive biases, right? But they're a subset of cognitive biases. And for those who are unfamiliar with what those are, cognitive biases are learned brain chemistry. They're invisible scripts in our heads, essentially. And they contribute in large part to some of the behaviors that we exhibit, right? And so visibility biases are specifically the cognitive biases that allocate our attention in discriminatory ways. A great example of a visibility bias is not one that I discovered or am responsible for, but it came out of some research from 2021, and it's called the racial attention deficit. And they were able to empirically demonstrate that white Americans are 33% more likely to overlook their Black peers, even when they've been incentivized to pay attention to them. And so that's one side of the underrecognition coin. And there are dozens and dozens of these visibility biases and counting.
Sure.
And then we have the invisibility tax. And that's the extra bit of time, energy, money, resources, frankly, that underrecognized folks are asked to pay by society in order to be visible, and especially to be as visible as their peers who are not underrecognized. A great example of this is, again, one that I'm not responsible for. It comes out of some work by Stephanie O'Connell Rodriguez, and it's called the ambition penalty. Some folks listening will hear this and be like, aha, I know exactly what this is without me having to explain. But the ambition penalty is the scenario wherein if you show up as ambitious, you are penalized. You are seen as words I probably shouldn't say on this show.
Say them anyway.
So you're bossy, you're a bitch, you're uppity, you're
behaviors that in one category of individual are admired and in a different category of an individual are denigrated.
That's exactly right. And O'Connell specifically notes this in women and girls, and notes that this is often mistaken for the confidence gap in women and girls, right? That it's not a confidence gap. It is, in fact, an ambition penalty, that someone is accurately assessing their environment and saying, you know what? Better to be seen as lacking confidence than to be penalized in this way, right? My own work sort of expands it and says, no, actually, this is a thing that's happening to all underrecognized folks. So yeah,
I again, as a white male, right? I don't suffer this as often, perhaps. Although when I was a kid, I was a geek, and therefore I had an ambition penalty. So I experienced it then.
Yeah.
By the luck of the draw, I didn't, I came out of that okay. But no, I get it a little bit. I was also very small physically.
And that's another,
and that's another one of those, right?
Yeah,
absolutely. So I get it at some level, but not to the same level that a Black woman would.
Yeah.
Right. So I applaud you for raising our awareness of this. And I hope all of the listeners take note. So we're over time, but this has been a fascinating conversation. Chloé, thank you so much. Do you have a special gift that you'd like to offer the listeners who stuck around this long?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for sticking around for this nerdy conversation. If you have questions, and I'm sure you will, then I invite you to my foundational visibility clinic. And this visibility clinic is, think of it as a primer, right? Where I basically walk you through all of the nerdy stuff that underlies everything that we've spoken about today, but I do it in a way that's like accessible and fun and and bite-sized, right? So if you have questions, they will be answered in this foundational clinic. So I invite you to follow the link that I'm sure is going to be somewhere, and take advantage of that. So that is my gift to you all.
Thank you. And the best way for people to reach out to you if they want to learn more.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can often find me doing my nerdiest fest on LinkedIn, which is where I tend to share any new discoveries or things that come up as far as under recognition is concerned. And sometimes I'm on Instagram, though not often. So if you want to follow me there, please do. There's a great repository of knowledge around brand science and under recognition there that you can peruse as well. So, yeah.
Thanks. And that concludes our show for today. Thanks so much to my guest, Chloé Nwangwu, the brand scientist and director of NobiWorks. I hope you learned something about how to evade the invisibility tax. I know I did. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to the Profit Minds podcast. This is your host, Dr. Stephen Kirch. Please visit www.profitminds.net for other episodes or to contact me. Thank you for your positive feedback, comments, questions, and for sharing this show with others. Thanks for listening. Have a grateful day.